Brian, Brandon, welcome. I was going to say welcome to the podcast, but we're just here to chat.
Yeah.
And I wanted to invite you guys because we are on a journey, as many of the listeners know, of our churches journeying to be together to become one new church, which is very exciting.
Yeah.
And we've had many meetings and announcements and videos. And so we thought that it would be helpful for both our communities to hear, I think, a lot of what has been said and maybe some things that haven't yet been discussed, but in a conversational, maybe more casual way. Because Brian, I know that if you could, you would sit down with everybody and be like, all right, I need some Earl Grey tea, and I want to hear your story and hear how you're processing, hear what you're doing, and and I mean, I know you can't do that with everybody.
Yeah.
But this is our chance.
Yeah.
Right on.
So we're gonna do that today. The hope would be that we can talk about some. Well, I would love to hear you guys kind of recount the story. I think it's fun that you do that together. And then we'll talk a little bit about like, why are we doing this? How is it going to work? Who's going to be in leadership? How does this affect me as somebody who's a member of Slate Church or of Koinonia? And just kind of open the door and just chat.
That's great.
Yeah, that is good.
So I think we should start with like, how did we get here? And Brandon, I'll let you start because I know that this idea has been brewing in you for a long time.
Yeah.
So why don't we start there and jump in?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love the church, capital C church.
Yep.
And so I'm often praying for other churches. I'm often telling our church to give money to other churches. When we encourage people to tithe at our church, I actually say, before you start tithing to our church, so you know it's not about us, here's 5 other churches I'd love for you to tithe to for a few months.
Wow.
See if you've noticed a difference, and then start giving to our church if it's
Interesting.
if it's working,
So cool. That's so funny.
But just so that we can take away that layer that but it also shows unity in the city.
Yeah, that's cool.
With that said, Koinonia for some reason has always been kind of closer to my heart, and it doesn't mean that we're all brothers and sisters, all the other churches cheering them on, but Koinonia has always been just there in my mind, and ever since I moved to the city, have had massive respect for what's gone on in this congregation. And so a number of years ago, probably 2.5 now, I just started praying for Koinonia throughout the pandemic. I knew that every church was going through stuff, but because, again, Koinonia was so close to my heart, I was like, I need to pray for them. And during that course of prayer, just felt like God impressed something upon my heart, which doesn't always happen in times of prayer. Sometimes it's pretty standard. Why are you guys 2 different churches? Kind of kept coming to my mind. And so I wrestled with that for 1.5 years with my mentors, overseers, even a few of our staff, and just going like, what does this mean? Like, I feel like we're supposed to be one church, but like,
Right.
we don't do that. Like, that's not something people
Right.
do.
Is that an option?
Yeah, I've heard of
Right.
church splits, as
Right.
many people have said.
Yes.
Never heard of like 2 healthy churches coming together. I've even heard of a church that's just like down and out approaching a church that can bail them out.
Right.
I haven't heard of this. And
Yeah.
so I remember having a conversation with a close friend going, what would this look like if I were to have a conversation? And then after 1.5 years of talking to one of my close friends and mentors, he basically said to me, are you more afraid of man or are you more afraid of God? Like, if God's placed this in you, what are you afraid of? And I think at the time what I was afraid of was ruining the relationship that I felt was continuing to grow between Brian and I.
Yeah.
We had a good relationship ourselves, but
Yeah.
even our churches.
Yes.
I was more afraid of losing that than gaining the possibility of something I wasn't even sure was a possibility.
Right.
So I approached Brian on September
21st?
21st, 2022.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Almost a year ago, so 11 months ago.
Almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so wild.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What a long year.
And I've never had a more, I felt, incoherent conversation.
Really?
Well, I was stumbling over what I was trying to say, but by the time we got to the end, and you can, reflect on how your perspective of that conversation went. But by the end, there was clarity.
Yeah.
But I think it was just because I was like, I can't mess this up.
Yeah, you looked nervous. You looked anxious. Yeah. And carrying great respect in the conversation.
Yeah.
You truly were.
And that was like, that kind of like kicked it off. Like
Right.
the word merge came out of my mouth. And honestly, up until that point, that wasn't even what I was like.
Oh, so that wasn't like a part of your
Package
language as you were
thing?
praying and processing.
No, it was
Interesting.
just, why are we two different churches?
Yeah.
What if we were one church?
Right.
And then at the very end of the conversation, almost simultaneously, I don't even know if this is something I told you, because you were saying like the word merge had never popped into your head, even through the whole conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at almost the same moment, that's when all of a sudden the word merge came out of my mouth. And I think it was a summary of everything I was feeling.
Right.
But it wasn't like, I wasn't coming in to say the word merge,
Right.
if that makes sense. I was just trying to get all this off my chest. And then merge came out, and then he's like, I just heard that too. And I'm like, it must have been the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah, because we had connected together years prior and even months prior.
Yeah.
But just to pray for the city, talk about Slate, talk about Koinonia, how are we leading through the situations.
Yes.
And yet, this invitation, hey, can we get together, felt different. It felt deeper. There was weight to it. I could just sense it, see it in you.
Yeah.
And so then when we got together and you were nervously anxious, respectfully communicating, that's when I started to pray, Lord, what's he about to say?
Yeah.
And just ask God, just give him peace. And what am I to be prepared for? And I heard the word similar of merging. Mm-hmm. And then when you said it, I was like, man, that's what I heard too. And neither of us premeditated the conversation or the idea.
That's so wild. Mm-hmm. And I think, Brandon, it's one of the things that struck me once you shared it with me, Brian, that this idea, I was like, wow, I can't believe you prayed about it for so long.
Yeah.
Because even we had conversations and gone camping together. And I remember like, you were asking me questions about Koinonia and you were like, I just like to, learn how organizations work and how things
like I can't tip Nick off before everybody else.
No, I'm really thankful you didn't.
Yeah.
I'm really thankful you didn't. But to hear how you carried that and carried that idea, like you didn't carry it lightly. And so that really struck me when I heard the story. It was just like, oh, I can barely hold ideas in for a month if I think it's a good idea. And so I think that alone speaks to your heart and desire to see God's kingdom grow, and not just like, hey, what if we did something cool and let's see how big we can make this thing. Like that was never the point.
No.
Yeah.
Okay. So, sorry, go ahead.
That's a very valid point that speaks to how big we feel this idea is from God.
Yeah.
It wasn't a man-made thing or just, what would be exciting to do. And sincerely, I felt that almost like a baton pass of the idea for me then to pray into it and carry it. And I felt that weight as well.
Yeah.
And went to our elders who are spiritual overseers within Koinonia and said, here's an approach Brandon's brought to me, an idea. And I said to our team, feeling the weight of it, don't tell anyone, and I asked them not to tell their spouse, and I asked them just to pray solid for a week about it without even telling me their opinion. And so I felt that weight as well as you share it. It equally landed on me too.
It was interesting. Like I, waited that whole year and a half, but then the moment I released it, and I think you were going away to a cottage, or maybe were offered a cottage, and you're like, I'm just going to go and pray about this. I'll get back to you in a week. And it was like all of a sudden, all that waiting for a year and a half, I was like, a week? Like, how do I wait a week? And I think that was honestly in the whole process, that was probably the only week I struggled with the timing.
Yes.
Everything else has been in God's timing, but that was like, it felt like you released the most vulnerable dream you've had.
Yes.
And then you had to entrust it to somebody to go, let's see if he hears from God too.
Yeah.
So that was
Right,
cool.
because he could easily come back and be like, hey,
Totally.
like we're just coming out of the pandemic, leadership transition to Koinonia. Like we can't get it. Like that could have easily been a response.
Yeah.
Wow. That's so wild. Okay, so you guys have this meeting, that elders are praying about it. You've been processing it with your leadership team for a long time, or some time.
Yeah.
What happens after that? Just like a brief kind of outline of the story till we get to...
Yeah, on the Koinonia side, came back from that time away of prayer and then engaged our elders to conversation, and we asked a few questions, and you and I went back and forth, and Rebecca and I and you and Emma to bring some initial clarity to what are we sensing and discerning in this direction.
What are we talking about here?
And then our elders, and then I shared it with our board and said, hey, we want all of you to be praying about this. And so that started to progress. And you were updating your team and having deeper, expanded conversation. And then we said, I think we should do an initial meet and greet. Mm-hmm. And so we had a contingent of leaders from both churches gather, have a meal together, some conversation about this together, and where do we see that God could possibly be in this? And then the next step was, let's pull our formal leadership teams together to really map this out and talk it out, which eventually happened the beginning of December last year.
Yeah. And out of our formal leadership teams, one of the things that we did is we designated transition team members so that we could not fast track conversation, but those would be representatives of the voices of so that we could get somewhere with the conversation.
Right. Because you can't have a meeting with 25 people once a week for like 2 months.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Did we call it a merger team?
Yeah, merger team. Yeah. That's right. There was like some debate about what we should call it. Some people didn't like the word transition. Some people didn't like the word. And so we had this team, though, that was gathering, and we met a number of times. Mm-hmm. And initially, we were actually trying to go for let's try to get all this together by January to be able to bring to our churches.
Like January of 23.
23, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think there was just a collective on both sides going, maybe this is a little too quick. Like, let's pray into this. Let's even let ourselves feel it a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think that on both teams, there was still some questions that needed to be answered. There's a lot of background work you have to do before you just announce something to a lot of people. Because you don't want to announce something that provides confusion.
Right.
And so we wanted to be clear on big things. Like, we wanted to be clear, like, how do we approach the hot topics of society? We knew we had theological alignment pretty quick.
Yeah, that was clear.
Yeah, that was clear. And we had, the best of our theology minds on both sides sit in a room. We were there with them and just go, yeah, actually we're aligned here, but what about some of the nuanced topics?
Yeah.
So that was one thing. Governance, like, do we actually share a similar heart on governance? Mm-hmm. Do we did a quick, we did a financial risk assessment on both churches. Like, each analyzed the other church and went, would we be comfortable walking hand in hand with one another? Have they been responsible?
Right.
And I like your reference even to the word quick, and you hesitate there, but really our teams are quite in the mix and the know of where. So it was a summary level, high level of just, would we be comfortable with this?
Right.
Because we got competent leaders from both churches contributing, could quickly contribute to the conversation.
Yeah, the sensitive nature of the whole thing was, how do we do enough work that when we bring this, if we bring this to our congregations, they'll know we've done our homework, while not doing so much that it just seems like it's a done deal, because it wasn't.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that was like, I think that's honestly why I'm like, some of it's coming back. That's why we actually expanded the timeline even more.
Right.
Because we're like, we need to get that right. So this isn't just a show for everybody.
Right.
That people really are invited into the process, even though we're feeling really confident in this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a hard tension to walk. And that was one of the things that, as a staff member who was brought into the process a bit later, was like, how do we navigate this tension between we sense God is calling us in this direction, and we need to do some work before we can just share it publicly. Yet we want to share it publicly so we can bring everybody, and that tension is hard to. That's hard. Could you speak to that a bit? Because I know we've talked about it a little, and our conversations were helpful for me.
Yeah, it was challenging because we're also our leadership team's representative from both churches, 2025. Different personalities around the table, different approaches and perspectives. So some really wanted to hear the mapped out details of the plan.
Right.
And others were like, no, don't go there until we've had time to get to know each other and build relationship. And so we were really walking out that tension of this God idea in the middle, and then how do we navigate and bring team members around it? And so we did a lot of conversations, processing. Initially, too, there was, okay, what would be helpful for Slate side or Slate leaders? And then what would be helpful for Koinonia? And we would assess that. And that was helpful, but at times was like, this is us and you, and and back and forth. And so it was really, when things started to take more momentum, was when we started to stop looking at each other's sides and said, what about this new church that God's doing?
Yeah.
And that's when it started to pick up as this is about new, not this is what we need to get for the past.
Yeah.
And it just started to bring us together quicker, more in unity, more just it felt right.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. It's so interesting, right? Like, we all have different approaches in our lives. That's what makes the body of Christ so unique and interesting.
True. Yeah.
And so when it comes to our leadership teams, that's no different. Like, I think every comment that could have been made has been made over the last year. And it's like, at times, like, when you're trying to lead, that can be frustrating. Like, it would be frustrating on the other end.
Sure.
And yet beautiful at the same time, because we actually get to have the real substance in the room.
Yeah.
And I think that's the benefit we got from slowing down the process and being in more conversation and letting it breathe a little bit.
Yep. That's good.
So that when we picked back up the conversation, okay, what is the new timeline? It felt like we were ready to hit the ground running, in the sense that, hey, it's time to bring people in. I think we've solved some of that that question.
Yeah. Cool. So that then you arrived at around sometime in the spring, I think, right? And then it was a bit of a process to say, okay, now let's announce this to our staff teams, and then let's announce this to our church and say, hey, this is where we feel God's leading us. Come on the journey. And so now we're out from that public announcement, and you guys have spent so much time together to get to this process. Like, we truly have. I think that. I have a unique window because you're my dad. I know you share with me what you're up to, and you ask me for prayer, and I know when you have a meeting till midnight, like, because you're like, yo, we had a meeting till midnight. Can you pray for us? And I think that our church, I think it's helpful for our churches to know how much time you guys have actually spent together, because you are not just in a relationship because you happen to be leading at Slate and you happen to be leading at Koinonia. Like, you have a real friendship as well as a leadership working relationship. So I'm curious, like, what do you guys like about working together? Like, what have you learned about, like, what are you enjoying? Because you've spent a lot of hours together.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it is.
Because I know there are things. This isn't a setup question.
No. I think the easiest, I'll go to start, but I think the easiest thing to just, like, point at would be, like, Brian's so friendly, he's so nice, like, he's so pastoral. And it's like, if anybody has even been listening to this podcast, I think they've gathered.
Yeah.
But, like, our friendship started way back. I was leading a student ministry, and so was Brian. And there were some questions around, like, what do we do with this group of people that keeps going back and forth?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, right.
Yeah, and at that point, what we were leading in particular started to take on almost like a young adult collective feel. So it was drawing a lot of young adults from other churches, which I was uncomfortable with. And Brian took notice of this and just kind of came into a conversation and asked me, hey, what's going on? What I loved about that, and that I think that set the foundation for friendship moving forward, was Brian's not only nice, but he can have conversations about the real stuff. And I always knew in the back of my head from that point forward, like, Brian is never going to have a fake relationship with me. And that's meant so much to me, because I've had many relationships that, unfortunately, it's like, man, like, what? I thought we were on the same page.
Right.
And I just knew that wasn't going to be a problem with Brian. So this entire time, one of the things that I've enjoyed is just, I know in every conversation, I'm going to get the real Brian showing up. And that is more security than a human can ask for. But that foundation was laid 7 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. Yep.
And it's not like we had a ton of interactions between then and this all picking up.
Right.
But we had enough to know, like, man, I've got a lot of respect for him. And that's just stayed consistent.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And what's grown in my heart for you, Brandon, through this journey was your consistent walk with Jesus. I love how you still say it, is in this, we're believing part of the idea behind this merging is, what if Waterloo Region would be known for Jesus, Jesus showing up, Jesus transforming lives, Jesus giving hope, and us as churches, not just the two becoming one, but the churches in the region working in unity together as one church for Jesus to be known that this is the hope of your life, the hope of the world. And that's been consistent in you as long as I've known you. Your heartbeat was that when you were leading the student ministry, and then as you began to navigate towards starting Slate Church, but here's what it's about, is making disciples of Jesus. And then as we grew closer to pray during the pandemic about the ministry, and I still heard that in your heart, and even hear it, still hear it deepen now as I get to know you. It's consistent when we went out water skiing and motorbiking. It doesn't leave you, as you meet people on the dock, or as I introduced you to some of my family. That doesn't leave you. That's still the heartbeat of what's in you. Or I joined you this summer. We stopped in at one of your campsites. I brought some friends along. And again, he and Emma Jesus is in them. They are like Jesus, and that comes out. And so that just draws me in friendship. Why wouldn't I want to be close to this guy who aims to walk with Christ in a similar way, same way I want to? Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, I think it's helpful for people from our churches to realize, like, you guys are actually friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And even just on like that friend level, you just referenced a number of things we've done together. I love, like last week, it was like, hey, I'm going barefooting this weekend. You want to join? And I was like, oh my gosh, yes. Now I actually didn't barefoot because I was too chicken. But I loved being on the boat.
Yeah, you got the ski
Next
on.
time, you
I
can
got
do
the
it.
ski on. Yeah.
You're strong enough. You could play yourself around.
Yeah, I don't think I realized I was getting sick then because I was like, why do I feel so weak?
That was
And
the
now it all
morning.
makes sense.
Yes.
But I was like, why won't I get out of this boat?
That's so funny.
And Nick, as you unpack this, I think we've just scratched the initial surface of our friendship, because we've got a lot of things on our list we'd like to do together that are similar passions and interests.
Yeah.
And yet we've been respectfully holding off on that too as we walk out this relationship, because it's not all about us.
Yes.
Very little is about us, but we're excited that God's bringing our families and our friendships closer as we walk this journey with Him.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because just the phrase, like, this isn't about us, because I've seen that so clearly in both of you that like it could be very easy and potentially very tempting for one church to look at the other and be like, oh, if we merge with them, this is what we could do. And I have noticed that as a staff member and as a member of Koinonia, like just seeing the process, it's like, oh wow, no, this isn't about us. And and both of you consistently come back to that point that like this is about the body of Christ, and what could God do with the church that is unified, specifically with our two churches that are unified. What could He do? And so that, I think, is an important thing that we keep coming back to, that you both as leaders consistently draw us back to. And I think that's important for our church community to hear as well. So maybe you guys could speak to that a little bit of, so we've been on this process and now we're working on some of the formal legal things of what it means to become one new church. What is next? Like, so we're eventually in January is our timeline to launch as a new church with a new name. 3 campuses. Like, what? We're not just gonna like hit January and put up a new sign and be like, all right, everyone keep doing what you're doing. So like, let's. What were
Wish
you
it
gonna
was
say?
that easy.
That sounds like a dream.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Like, we'll get to dreams eventually, but just practically for our church, like what's next?
Yeah. I'll talk about what we're doing right now, and to get to the next is, so you've unpacked a bit in this conversation of us drawing together as friends and leaders, and we then have been working to lead our teams, our leadership teams, to come together, and then we share it with our staff and congregations. And so right now working with our staff and drawing them together. And we've had some beautiful times already with our combined staff times. We've had obviously meetings as 2 staff teams together. We've had backyard pool hangout times and played volleyball. Yeah. We've had meals together as staff. We've had chapel worship together. And so that's part of the journey of bringing, I think, the next levels of people together. Yeah. Staff, or leadership, staff, and congregations toward, and then they're starting to work together. So as staff, we're encouraging you, hey, Nick, talk with Sarah Ruth about youth ministry, and you guys pray into it as well and bring back insights and ideas that God unpacks to you. And we're doing similar with our worship teams and kids ministry, and to say, bring this back, encourage you, start talking and praying into what we've been talking and praying into and sensing. And so that's what this journey of this fall is between now and January, is bringing teams, staff, volunteers, leadership together to keep working on it.
Yeah. And like one of the, the phase we find ourselves in, not that we've actually put it to phases, but this kind of season is to invite our congregations into the conversation, get to know, okay, what are the things that concern, or what are the things that excite the people that attend our churches, that call Slate and Koinonia home. Yeah. And that's one aspect of it. And then the other was like a concerted effort to see, like, are there any red lights that we're unaware of? Like, are there any warning flags? Are there things that we need to be aware of in our congregations that because we haven't announced this yet, that people would be concerned about? And so the fact that we've been able to announce it, and we've had this public forum, whether it be town halls or I was saying, like, all of our pastoral staff have been like upping the amount of time they've been spending pastoring people during this season, answering questions. And then even the forum online that we've had to, if you have any question at all, you can submit it. It's all also been to go, okay, this is what we need to be able to answer. And are people with us?
Yeah, right.
And so one of the things we've had to discern in this season are we ready to move on to the next phase of what this looks like? Are we willing to commit?
Right.
And I think that one of the things that we were looking for is, it was said this way at some point. I believe somebody from Koinonia, it may have been from Slate, just said, like, it's going to need to take substantial evidence from our congregation to, like, thwart what we believe God is calling us to. Yeah. Like, it would need to be something really big to show us, okay, we were not discerning very well there.
Right.
And I think not only have we not seen that, but we've seen actually the complete opposite, where there are a lot of people that are really curious. Yeah. There's people that are concerned, of course. That shows a deep level of care for the community that people have been a part of.
Totally.
But negativity towards the whole idea, no, not very much at all. And through all of the avenues we just mentioned, like, people are actually quite positive, and they're leaning in, and they want to know more. They want to know how they can help. They want to know, how's this going to get answered? Yeah. But negativity, like, this isn't from God, hasn't been there. No. And so I think, we're coming to that place, and we're not even sure if this podcast comes out, it might be misaligned with some other timelines.
Sure.
We'll just say this. I think we're starting to feel very confident in moving forward with what this looks like.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We still have to discuss what that comms plan looks like. So if you're listening to this before,
we're working on
it.
Right.
Yeah. If you're listening to this afterwards, then it's going to sound a little dated, and that's okay.
Right. Because it will be history at some point.
At some point.
Exactly.
Yeah. So one of the questions that's come up in some of our forums that I think would be helpful for you guys to speak to is, so the goal would be for our 3 campuses, like Bloomingdale, the city location at EBC, and the Maxwell's location, Sunday evenings, would all continue to exist and operate. How do we become a new community if we're going to stay in the same place? I think that would be helpful for, maybe you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, this excites me because at the heart of this vision and direction is unity. And because we know that as a kingdom principle, unity is a kingdom principle. And we believe as we as churches manifest that, walk it out, we're going to experience something that's bigger than us. And so we've got intention is to have these 3 campuses continue because God's at work in all those locations already.
Yeah.
He's at work in lots of ministry areas of both churches. And so we don't want to stop God. God, keep going and show us what this is about. And what we sense where some of the unity is coming is relationship. So our teams becoming one team instead of separating, staying 2.
Yeah.
So becoming one team and coming together for worship, for prayer, and not just as staff teams, but then as congregations.
Yeah.
So last week we had our first worship night together, worship and prayer together. And the feedback, the testimonies out of that night was just so encouraging. There was a lot of work to already recognize, okay, this is how our worship team leads, and this is how theirs.
This is your planning center and our planning center. How we're gonna do that.
And so there was the obvious things to navigate.
Yeah.
But the experience out of it was just like comments I heard where it feels like home already. It feels like one church already.
Yeah.
The eagerness, the desire to combine our vision and work together and seek God together. That was all. So I believe as we do some of these steps of staff working together, so instead of duplicating, like you talked about earlier, is combining and talk about initiatives and vision together. Then as congregations come together, then they come away with it with the same vision and heart that's been communicated or sought after God.
Yeah.
And that unity just keeps stirring in us to go, because our desire is not to create like a big location where everybody just comes to and we've got the biggest building or the biggest gathering spot in the city. That would be then putting the focus on us or, something we've made.
Yeah.
We truly believe it's to be the focus is on Jesus and making disciples who go. And so a lot of this is about going. So we gather and unite as one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one name for a new church. And then we go into our worlds and share all that. So that's some of it. So it's common vision, common times of gathering, different locations, but same heartbeat as we focus on Jesus together.
Yeah, and what I hear you saying in that too is that it's going to require from all of us a faith that it's the Spirit of God that will unify us.
Right.
Like, because we aren't unified as a church because we all go to the same location globally, right?
That's right.
So that's even what I hear you saying is like this is going to take some posturing of faith to say like, Father, unify our locations under this vision of new church, whatever we're calling it. And that will take an element of, obviously there's practically lots we can do with culture and language and resources, but ultimately, like you're quoting from Ephesians, it's the one Spirit that unifies us, and we're going to posture ourselves in faith to experience that unity. That's, Do you want to add anything to that, Brandon?
Well, if you just start with that question of like, is it possible to unify communities? Yes. The how is what we're talking about, not whether or not it's possible.
Right.
That's good.
And I think we're just taking the long route there, not the short route. And the short route would mean bringing everybody to the same location.
Right.
And yet we would lose something that I think has been evident since the beginning that we both value. And by, I don't mean Brian and I, but our congregations, which is local expression.
Yeah.
That's good.
And so if we just gather in one place, what it does is for the Christian that's known God, like it works. I'll drive 35, 45, hour and 15. Some of us maybe an hour and a half to church. That's fine. I know God. And yet we know, and I think most of what we do on Sundays in both of our churches is equip the saints for the work of the ministry. And we have to be aware that that is also a place where people come in to meet Jesus
Right.
for the first time. They want to be around the Jesus people. They want to know, what is this about?
Yeah.
And so I want a Jesus community. We want a Jesus community within reach of people wherever they find themselves without always having to take long treks to get there.
Yes.
'Cause that's okay for Christians that know Jesus.
Right.
But for people that are like, I don't even know how I feel about this right now, let's get it close to people.
Right.
Cool.
And so, you might be taking a bit of a risk on not just the critical mass being the thing that creates the momentum.
Right.
But what if God was doing something bigger? Like, what if disciples was his end goal and not just big crowds, as the whole book of Mark shows us, right?
Yeah, totally.
The crowds are fickle. And so really excited about the unity that can be created by the Holy Spirit speaking to all of us as we all identify as one church.
Yeah.
and the things that God's going to do as Brian. I don't want to repeat all the things he said, but through our teams and through the leadership, through the language, through all the rest. And I think if we were thinking about, let's say, multi-site, which always gets a bad rap, it seems like, and I think it sometimes gets bad rap. I'll just speak to this quick, because when leaders are in it for themselves, it breaks down because everything is serving a platform, an individual, a name.
Yes.
Maybe the name of a church. We've already broken down a lot of those components. We've submitted our names.
Yes.
If this was about us, we probably wouldn't have gotten to this point because it's been a long, long journey.
Yes.
All of these things. But if you think about like starting a new location, we go, but you would send leaders where the DNA would already be in them, and so that community would already be. Not necessarily. I mean, 10 leaders aren't that great that if you start a new location and 300 people show up, already you got to figure out how do you unify this thing to the rest of the church.
Right.
And the reality is that as pastors, our job has always been to lead people in a direction and recognize that we have the people that God has given us. Not the people we want to have, not the type of person we want to have,
right,
but the people that God has given us to lead. Like, we don't get to choose who shows up.
Right.
Yeah.
And we are always responsible for leading whoever shows up in the direction God has called us. And that doesn't change whether it's multi-site or single site.
That's good.
And I mean, that's what's been in my heart this whole time. But that's exactly what Moses and the Israelites did. Like,
I thought of it as you said it.
They didn't take the short route to the promised land. Like, they took the route that to them wouldn't have made sense at the time, but in looking back allowed for them to see God moving at every impasse.
Yeah. So then each difficult moment becomes an opportunity to see God at work and to be like shaped and formed by Him. My tendency and hope is to take the path of least resistance, but that seems to be so the opposite of what God uses to form us and shape us.
Other than the reality that the Israelites disobeyed God, so that's why they couldn't take it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we don't want to do that.
We've been seeking to obey God and follow in this journey, but trusting Him in the journey.
Yeah.
He didn't tell us whether it was a short one or a fast one or long, or we're 11 months in on the formal together, and we see God in it.
Yeah, I am. I'm really caught by the idea that as a pastor, I don't want to look back on my life, and I certainly wouldn't want to look back on the history of our church and our being what's here right now, and be able to tell people how it all happened. Like, that's such a boring life. Like, the Bible just doesn't make sense sometimes.
Right.
It's like, how did that guy get from there to there to there? Like, how did Joseph go from a pit to leading all of Egypt?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then what Joseph didn't do is write a book and be like, here's how to go from a pit to a palace in 25 years.
Yeah. Take my master class.
Yeah.
Pit to the palace.
And so I love the fact that, I have a church growth book sitting on my desk right now amongst a bunch of other books. I think it's worth knowing. Like, I don't want to be absent-minded as I'm leading.
Yeah.
And that's good stuff to carry in the back of my mind, but I'm not following it.
Right.
Why? Because the voice of God is so much more important. And I think that as we follow the voice of God, I think we're going to be surprised around every corner at what He's doing, how He's doing it. And when we look back and people are coming to us because it's already happening, hey, how are you guys doing this merge? Like, I've been having this idea, and it's going to have a good effect for the kingdom of God in Ontario.
Yeah.
I already see it.
Yeah.
And I want to point people not to how we did it, but the types of people that God used to do it. It requires humility.
Yeah.
It requires self-sacrifice. It requires a lot of time in prayer.
Yeah.
It requires perseverance through frustration.
Okay.
It requires hearing voices of dissent, but being able to come back with a soft and gentle answer.
Yeah.
It requires knowing why you're in this and not just that you feel you want to do it.
Right.
And none of that is like strategy. That's like, did God do enough work in Brandon and Brian before this idea landed on the table? And I think that the answer for most of it would be yes. And then we've been doing some of that work through the process as well.
Yeah. Well, I've noticed that it has become an invitation for discipleship. Like this, even just the fact that this is an idea.
Yeah.
What it brings up in me has become like an invitation to say, okay, God, clearly this new idea is showing me areas where I have not yet been shaped into your image. Like,
Right.
Yeah.
my hope would be that our churches can think about it the same way.
Yeah.
That it can be an opportunity that God will use to deeply shape us and form us. It's been that. I maybe sometimes wish it wasn't, but because like to be transparent, I imagine you guys too. This process has brought up things that you didn't realize. Like, oh, this is something that I struggled with.
100%.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
It's neat, Nick, that you go there because that's been part of our journey. So actually, we've been growing as disciples individually, but also together, probably as brothers.
Yeah.
Because we've literally looked each other in the eye and said, are you being honest with me? Are you being real with me?
Right.
We've gone back into our closets, so to speak, of our lives and said, hey, I want you to know this. I struggled with this, or I got victory at this point in my life. And we've been that honest with each other. And I think that's the ironing, sharpening iron, or growing as disciples together, because we wanted to be, as you highlight, humility, transparency.
Yeah.
We want to be submit to one another out of reverence for Christ.
Yeah.
Because we believe that was the foundation that would allow this to grow and go forward. And I remember you went all the way back. I don't know if it was junior high or how far back you went. And said, Brian, I just want you to know, like, this is if there's
story.
anything to come out, I want you to know me through and through.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then that just drew me out to say, well, let me submit my journey a little longer because I'm older. But and it felt so real. It felt good. It felt safe because we were two brothers who had our eyes on Jesus. Our wives were with us, the same heart and desire, and it was a discipling moment. Like we've had a number of those through these 11 months already.
That's cool.
And what church growth book starts with, hey, sit down with the other leader and just like admit all the big sins that you've done in your life. Get it all out there. I haven't read one yet.
Oh, man.
Maybe we will write that book. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's been really good. It's been really good.
It was cool the kind of direction this conversation has taken, because the heart behind this thing has been to make disciples more effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now here we are talking about how the idea of making disciples more effectively has caused us to have to become a disciple.
Yeah.
And to be shaped and formed. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And so we'll change gears in a minute, but I just want for everybody who's listening to consider how to take on this posture that you guys are describing as we continue on, because we've got lots of work yet to do to become, to put the sign up, become One New Church.
Yeah.
And along the way, like I'm going to continue to see it this way, and I know you guys will as well, is to say like, okay, God, how are you going to use this to form me as a disciple?
Yeah.
Whatever that may be.
Yeah,
Whether
exactly.
whether it's concerns about what is our youth ministry going to be like, or maybe it's parents who are thinking, what does this mean for my kids' discipleship, or people who've been serving in our churches for many years and they're wondering what's going to happen with what I'm doing and what I'm bringing. Pause. And acknowledge that God that the opportunity is here for God to use this to shape us and form us as disciples. And so let's let him do that.
Yeah. Right on.
Cool.
Good word.